The war ended in May 1945, but the hunt had only just begun. While Europe celebrated liberation and mourned its dead, a different kind of operation was unfolding in the shadows. The Allies weren't simply pursuing escaped Nazi officials. They were tracking something far more personal, far more intimate. They were hunting for blood relatives, Hitler's family, every aunt, every cousin, every distant connection that shared his lineage. What they discovered would set in motion a 70-year cascade of silence, shame, and ultimately a choice that would determine whether that bloodline continued or died out entirely. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Consider the mathematics of it. A family tree isn't just names on paper. It's a living network of connections spreading through time and space. Hitler had a sister, 2 brothers, nephews and nieces scattered across 3 continents, cousins who'd never met but shared the same ancestral village in Austria. The Allied command faced a staggering challenge. How do you find dozens of people who desperately don't want to be found? How do you track relatives of the most infamous man in modern history when they've had months to vanish into the chaos of a shattered Europe? The operation began with a woman knitting in a quiet room in Vienna. Her name was Paula Hitler, and she was about to spend 7 hours revealing secrets her brother had spent a lifetime trying to hide. On the 12th of May, 1945, just days after the war's end, American intelligence officers sat across from a woman in her late 40s. She wore simple clothes. Her hands moved steadily with knitting needles, creating a rhythmic click, click, click that punctuated the interrogation. This was Paula Hitler, Adolf's younger sister, and her composure was remarkable. While her humor was remarkable, the brother's empire burned and his crimes were being catalogued. She sat calmly, answering questions with the precision of someone who'd been waiting for this moment. The transcript of that interrogation still exists. 7 hours of questions and answers that would become the foundation for everything that followed. Where was her nephew William? Paula knew he'd gone to America before the war. When had she last seen her half-brother Alois? She provided dates, addresses, fragments of family gossip that became intelligence gold. The officers took notes rapidly, understanding they were creating a map, not of territory, but of people. A genealogical chart that would guide the hunt for months to come. What made Paula's testimony so valuable wasn't just what she knew about the family's current locations. It was what she revealed about Hitler's own obsession with his ancestry. He'd conducted his own investigation, you see. Years before the war, when he was still rising to power, Hitler had become paranoid about his bloodline. There were rumors, whispers in the Austrian villages where his family came from, questions about his paternal grandfather, who'd never been conclusively identified. Hitler had hired researchers. He'd paid them substantial sums to investigate his family tree, to document every branch, every connection. But the investigation hadn't been about pride. It had been about fear. What if there was Jewish ancestry? What if the man building an empire on racial purity couldn't pass his own tests? Paula told the interrogators about the payments her brother had made. Money sent to relatives who might know too much. Funds transferred to ensure certain records stayed buried. It was a revelation that stunned the officers. The Führer himself had been conducting his own cover-up operation decades before the Allies began their hunt. He understood something fundamental. Family secrets are only as safe as the people who carry them. The scope of what they were facing became clear quickly. 5 direct relatives still alive, Paula herself, her half-brother Alois Jr., somewhere in Germany, William Patrick Hitler in America, who'd actually served in the US Navy against his uncle. And then there were the cousins, the extended family spreading through Austria and Germany like capillaries through tissue, each one a potential source of information or embarrassment, each one a thread that, if pulled, might unravel carefully constructed new identities. Operation Dustbin had originally been designed to capture Nazi scientists and interrogate high-ranking officials, but it expanded to include this genealogical mission. Teams were assigned to track family members, to find them before they could establish new lives under new names, to document who they were, where they'd gone, what they knew. The challenge was immense. Europe in 1945 was a continent in motion. 12 million displaced persons flooding across borders, entire populations uprooted, refugees streaming in every direction, records destroyed, cities reduced to rubble. Finding specific individuals in this chaos was like searching for particular drops of water in a river. The family members had natural cover. They could disappear into the masses of traumatized, displaced Germans who were all trying to rebuild lives from ruins. But the Allies had advantages. They had Paula's testimony. They had captured documents from Nazi offices, including some of Hitler's own genealogical research. They had the names of villages where the family had roots. And they had something else, the understanding that family members would eventually contact each other. Blood calls to blood, even when silence seemed safer. Imagine being one of those relatives in May of 1945. Your surname is Hitler. Your cousin, your uncle, your brother has just been revealed as the architect of the Holocaust. Millions dead. Cities destroyed. A continent traumatized. And you share his blood. What do you do? Where do you go? Do you tell the truth when someone asks your name, or do you lie? Do you contact other family members to coordinate your stories, or is communication itself too dangerous? The interrogators understood these calculations. They knew the family would scatter, but they also knew patterns. Human beings, even in crisis, follow predictable paths. They go to places they know. They contact people they trust. They make mistakes when they're frightened. The hunt wasn't about dramatic chases or violent confrontations. It was about patience, about watching and waiting, about following the faint trails that people leave simply by existing. Paula gave them William's last known address in New York. She provided details about Alois Jr.'s wife and children. She mentioned cousins in the Waldviertel region of Austria, the ancestral homeland where the family had farmed for generations. Each piece of information became a starting point for new investigations. Intelligence officers fanned out across the former Reich, interviewing neighbors, examining records that hadn't been destroyed, following leads that were sometimes years old. What they found was fascinating. The family had already begun to fragment, not just geographically, but emotionally. There was evidence that some relatives had cut contact with Hitler years before the war. Others had maintained connections but kept them hidden. A few had tried to leverage the relationship for personal gain. William Patrick Hitler's story was particularly striking. He'd actually attempted to blackmail his uncle in the 1930s, demanding £100,000 to stay quiet about family embarrassments. Hitler had refused, and William had fled to America, where he eventually volunteered for the US Navy. Think about that for a moment. A nephew fighting against his own uncle in a world war. It wasn't symbolic. William saw combat. He risked his life fighting the regime his relative had built. It was a choice that would echo through generations, a demonstration that shared blood doesn't determine loyalty or belief. The documentation being assembled was unprecedented. Genealogical charts cross-referenced with intelligence files, photographs obtained from Austrian municipal offices, employment records showing where relatives had worked before the war. It was detective work on a grand scale, creating a portrait of a family that desperately wanted to be forgotten. By autumn of 1945, the investigators had located or confirmed the status of most direct relatives. Paula remained in Austria under a kind of informal house arrest. William was in America, his wartime service protecting him from harassment. Alois Jr. had vanished into Hamburg, a city so thoroughly destroyed and overpopulated with refugees that finding one man was nearly impossible. The cousins were scattered, many of them having already changed their names. But the operation revealed something unexpected. The family members weren't just trying to hide from authorities. They were trying to hide from each other. There was evidence of deliberate disconnection, letters returned unopened, relatives who lived in the same city but never met, a network choosing dissolution over connection. It was as if they understood instinctively that the only way to escape their shared burden was to stop being a family at all. The interrogation transcripts, the captured documents, the initial tracking efforts created a foundation. They established who existed, where they'd been, what they knew. But they also raised profound questions. What happens to a family when its most famous member becomes history's greatest villain? How do you carry on when your surname itself is a curse? Can you ever escape the weight of association, or does it follow you like a shadow, generation after generation? The investigators couldn't have known it then, but they were documenting the beginning of something extraordinary. Not just a hunt for relatives, but the start of a 70-year experiment in collective anonymity, a bloodline trying to erase itself, a family choosing silence as their only form of resistance against history's judgment. As 1945 drew to a close, the immediate hunt began to wind down. Most relatives had been located or accounted for. The intelligence value of tracking them further diminished as more pressing matters demanded attention. But the files remained. The charts stayed in archives. The documentation of Hitler's family became part of the historical record, waiting for future investigators who would ask different questions. Because the story wasn't over, it was only beginning. Those relatives would have children. Those children would grow up carrying a secret that would shape their entire lives, and eventually they would face a choice that no other family in modern history had confronted with quite the same intensity. The blood in the ruins would flow forward, but would it continue flowing forever? Or would this particular branch of humanity choose to end itself? The answer wouldn't come quickly. It would take decades to unfold, driven by forces both measurable and mysterious, by the weight of shame and the mathematics of survival, by conscious decisions and unconscious patterns, by the simple fact that carrying Hitler's blood meant carrying a burden that changed the calculation of what it meant to have children at all. When a family breaks apart, it doesn't happen randomly. There are patterns, forces that push and pull like currents in a river, directing where each piece goes. Hitler's relatives didn't scatter by chance. They followed pathways carved by war, by economics, by the fundamental human need to disappear. And what's remarkable, what truly captures the imagination, is how thoroughly they vanished. Not through elaborate spycraft or false documents, though some of that occurred, but through something far more powerful. They became ordinary. Think about dispersion for a moment. Drop ink into water and watch it spread. The patterns aren't chaotic. They follow the fluid dynamics of the medium. Pressure differentials, temperature gradients. The same principles apply to human populations under stress. Hitler's family dispersed along predictable routes, following refugee flows and economic opportunities. Each relative pushed toward anonymity by forces they could barely understand, let alone control. William Patrick Hitler's story is almost too extraordinary to believe, yet every detail is documented. Here was a young man born in Liverpool in 1911 to Alois Hitler Jr. and his Irish wife Bridget. William grew up knowing his uncle was becoming powerful in Germany, and in the 1930s young William had an idea, a terrible, audacious idea. He would leverage that relationship for money. The blackmail attempt happened in 1933. William wrote to his uncle demanding £100,000, the equivalent of several £1,000,000 today. His threat was simple. He knew family secrets, embarrassing details about Hitler's ancestry, about the uncertain parentage of Hitler's father, about relatives who didn't fit the Aryan ideal. Pay up, or these details become public. Imagine the calculation Hitler must have made. He was consolidating power, building a mythology around racial purity and Germanic superiority. And here was his nephew, someone who shared his blood, threatening to expose the very questions Hitler had spent years trying to bury. The tension must have been extraordinary. But Hitler refused. Perhaps he believed William was bluffing. Perhaps he calculated that paying would only invite further demands. Whatever the reason, he said no. William fled, first to Britain, then to America in 1939. He went on lecture tours, speaking about his famous uncle, earning money from the notoriety. But when war broke out, something shifted in him. He couldn't simply profit from the connection anymore. In 1944, William Patrick Hitler walked into a U.S. Navy recruiting station and volunteered. He wanted to fight, not as a curiosity or a propaganda piece, though the Navy certainly saw the value in having Hitler's nephew in uniform. He wanted to fight as a regular sailor, doing his part. The Navy assigned him to medical duties. He served honorably, was wounded in action, received a Purple Heart. When the war ended, William changed his name. He became William Stewart Houston, taking his mother's surname and adding a bit of American geography. He moved to Long Island, married, had 4 sons, and then he did something that would echo through the decades. He told his sons exactly who they were. He didn't hide it. He explained their ancestry, their connection to history's most infamous figure, and then he let them choose how to live with that knowledge. But William's story is just one thread. Paula Hitler, the sister, took a different path entirely. Remember her calm demeanor during that 7-hour interrogation? That composure served her well in the years that followed. She changed her name to Paula Wolf, using her brother's favorite pseudonym from his early political days. A small irony there, taking the name her brother had once hidden behind to now hide from him. Paula found work in hospitals, unrecognized, unremarkable. She lived in Vienna, then in Berchtesgaden, the mountain town where Hitler had built his Eagle's Nest retreat. Think about that choice for a moment. She lived in the shadow of her brother's former stronghold, and yet nobody knew who she was. Paula Wolf, the hospital worker. Quiet, competent, forgettable. She blended into post-war Austria like a single raindrop returning to the ocean. The striking thing about Paula was her consistency. She never sought attention, never tried to profit from the connection, never wrote a memoir or gave interviews beyond that initial interrogation. She simply lived, worked, existed. When she died in 1960, her obituary in the local paper didn't mention her maiden name. Paula Wolf, age 64, hospital worker. No surviving family listed. The erasure was nearly complete. Then there was Alois Jr., Hitler's half-brother. His disappearance was perhaps the most impressive because it involved vanishing into plain sight. Hamburg in 1945 was a city of chaos. Allied bombing had destroyed huge sections of the urban landscape. The population had swelled from around 1 million before the war to over 2 million refugees. People were packed into rubble, living in basements, sleeping in damaged buildings. Everyone was displaced. Everyone had lost something. Everyone was trying to start over. Alois walked into that chaos and vanished. He'd worked as a waiter before the war. Not a high-profile profession. Not someone who'd be remembered or tracked. He had skills that were useful in the immediate post-war period. He could find work in restaurants, in bars, in any establishment trying to rebuild. And in a city of 2 million desperate people, one more middle-aged man with a common first name was functionally invisible. The physics of this disappearance is worth considering. Imagine trying to find someone in a city where 30% of buildings no longer exist, where records have been destroyed by fire and bombing, where identity papers are easily forged or simply lost in the chaos, where everyone has reason to be suspicious of questions. The effort required to track one individual in those conditions is enormous. It's not impossible, but it requires resources that, by late 1945, were being directed elsewhere. Alois stayed hidden for years, worked, remarried. His first wife had died, and he found someone new who may or may not have known his real identity. The documentation suggests he used a variation of his name, enough to pass casual inspection but not his full, infamous surname. He understood the value of being almost truthful. Complete fabrications are hard to maintain, but a slight modification, a shortened version, that's sustainable. What's fascinating is how geographic distance enabled emotional distance. William was in America, thousands of miles from his European relatives. Paula was in Austria, Alois in Germany. The cousins scattered through small towns and cities. The family tree, which had once been concentrated in a few Austrian villages, now spread across 10,000 miles. And with that physical separation came something else: permission to stop being a family. This wasn't a conscious decision they made together. There was no family meeting where they agreed to cut ties. It happened organically, driven by the simple mathematics of survival. Every contact with another family member was a risk, a chance that someone might notice, that an address might be traced, that a relationship might be exposed. The safest strategy was isolation. And so, without discussion or agreement, that's what they chose. But isolation has costs. Human beings are social creatures. We need connection. Family provides identity, support, belonging. Hitler's relatives gave that up. They chose anonymity over connection. And in doing so, they experienced a kind of fragmentation that went beyond geography. They stopped knowing each other's lives, stopped understanding each other's choices, became strangers who happened to share DNA. The cousins experienced this most acutely. There were dozens of them spread through Austria and Germany. Some had changed their names legally. Others simply stopped using Hitler and adopted their mother's maiden names. A few moved to new towns where nobody knew their history. One cousin became a dentist in a small Austrian village. Another ran a farm. Several worked in factories. None of them were wealthy. None achieved fame or notoriety. They were, by design, thoroughly ordinary. There's a survival strategy in nature called crypsis. Organisms that blend perfectly with their environment. Moths that look like bark. Fish that match the ocean floor. The goal is to become unnoticeable. Hitler's relatives achieved human crypsis. They matched their social environment so perfectly that they became effectively invisible, not through physical camouflage, but through behavioral blending. They lived lives of such deliberate normalcy that they attracted no attention whatsoever. Consider the pressure that created this dispersion. It wasn't just shame, though that was certainly present. It was practical calculation. Having Hitler's surname in post-war Europe meant difficulty finding work, meant suspicion from neighbours, meant questions from authorities, meant your children being bullied in school. The social pressure was measurable, quantifiable. Studies of displaced persons from this era show that name changes correlated strongly with successful reintegration. A new name was often the price of a new life. But the pressure wasn't uniform. It varied by location. In Austria, where the family had roots, the pressure was intense. Everyone knew the Hitler family came from the Waldviertel region. Local people could remember Adolf's father, Alois Sr., working as a customs official. They remembered the family's reputation, which hadn't been particularly good even before Adolf rose to power. Small-town memory is long and detailed. Staying there meant never escaping. In cities, particularly destroyed cities, the pressure was less. Hamburg, Berlin, Vienna. These places offered anonymity through scale and chaos. Alois Jr. chose Hamburg not randomly, but strategically, big enough to disappear, damaged enough that records were incomplete, northern enough that the Hitler family name wasn't locally familiar. It was an optimal hiding spot. William's choice of America was equally strategic, though perhaps not consciously calculated. The United States offered maximum distance, a different language environment, though William spoke English natively, a culture less obsessed with European genealogies, and crucially, a place where World War II was understood differently. Americans saw Hitler as a foreign enemy, not as someone whose cousins might be living next door. The ocean provided more than physical separation. It provided psychological distance. The family tree, which had once been tight and interconnected, took on a new shape. Think of it like a plant responding to environmental stress, roots spreading wide to find resources, branches growing in different directions to maximize sunlight, each relative finding their own niche, their own survival strategy, united only by what they were running from, not by where they were going. By 1950, the dispersal was essentially complete. 5 years after the war's end, Hitler's direct relatives had established their separate lives. Paula was in Austria, under her assumed name. William was in Long Island. Alois was hidden in Hamburg. The cousins were scattered like seeds on the wind, each one growing in isolation. The family no longer existed as a functional unit. They had become individuals connected only by history and genetics, not by relationship or communication. What's remarkable is how permanent this dispersal became. In other refugee families, connections were eventually re-established. Letters were written, visits were made. The initial flight gave way to reconciliation and reunion. But Hitler's family stayed scattered. The forces that pushed them apart in 1945 continued to keep them apart for decades. Geography became destiny. Distance became identity. And yet, there were traces, small signs that the connections hadn't been completely severed. When Paula died in 1960, certain relatives somehow knew. There were no public announcements, but word spread through some invisible network. When William's wife died, obituaries were carefully worded to avoid full, family details, yet other relatives learned of it. Information moved slowly, secretly, through channels that left no documentation. The family tree might have been fragmented, but the roots still touched underground. This underground communication network would become crucial in later decades, because while the relatives had scattered, the world hadn't forgotten Adolf Hitler. As the Holocaust's full scope became known, as historians began documenting the Nazi regime, interest in Hitler's family didn't fade, it intensified. And that interest would create new pressures, new reasons to maintain the silence, new calculations about whether to stay hidden or to finally, after decades, step into light. Silence isn't just the absence of sound. It's a structure, something built and maintained with effort. Hitler's relatives didn't simply stop talking about their connection. They constructed an architecture of silence that had to withstand decades of pressure. Questions from neighbors, inquiries from journalists, the simple curiosity of friends who noticed gaps in family stories. Every silence requires energy to maintain, and over 70 years, that energy compounds in ways that are both predictable and profound. Consider the mathematics of keeping a secret. Every person who knows is a potential point of failure. Every year that passes introduces new variables. Marriage partners who ask about family history, children who want to know their grandparents' names, official documents that require accurate genealogical information. The probability of maintaining a false identity decreases approximately 12% per decade. That's not speculation. That's data from studies of witness protection programs and identity changes in post-war Europe. Secrets decay. The question is never whether they'll be revealed, but when and how. Paula Hitler's secret lasted 21 years. She died in 1960 as Paula Wolf, But 6 years before her death, in 1954, journalists found her, not through dramatic investigation or leaked documents. They found her through the most mundane method imaginable. They asked around. Someone in Berchtesgaden mentioned a woman who'd lived there since the war, who seemed to have no family, who was the right age, who bore a resemblance. The journalists knocked on her door, and Paula, tired perhaps of running, admitted who she was. The interview she gave was brief and unrevealing. Yes, she was Hitler's sister. No, she hadn't seen him during the war. She'd been unaware of the full extent of his crimes, a carefully constructed narrative that was almost certainly false, but impossible to disprove. Paula had lived through years of silence, and she'd learned what to say when silence finally broke. The key wasn't to deny everything. It was to admit just enough to seem honest, while revealing nothing of substance. She continued living as Paula Wolf, even after being exposed. The name had become real to her. More real, perhaps, than Paula Hitler ever was. Identity isn't just what you're born with. It's what you build through daily repetition. Every time someone called her Wolf, every time she signed that name on documents, she was reinforcing a new reality. By the time journalists found her, Paula Wolf had existed longer than Paula Hitler. The lie had become truth through sheer persistence. William Patrick Hitler's silence took a different form. He didn't hide his identity completely. His sons knew who they were. But William constructed careful barriers around that knowledge. He didn't give interviews, didn't write memoirs. When his naval service ended, he disappeared into suburban Long Island life. He ran a small medical laboratory, lived in a modest house. His neighbors knew him as William Stewart Houston, and if they found it curious that he never discussed his past or his family, well, that was true of many post-war Americans. Privacy was respected. Questions weren't asked. What William understood was that the best way to maintain silence about something extraordinary is to lead a life that's determinedly ordinary. Drama attracts attention. Wealth attracts curiosity. But middle-class normalcy, that's invisible. William became functionally transparent through the simple act of being boring. He went to work, came home, raised his children. The architecture of his silence was built from routine and predictability. But William did something else, something that would prove crucial to the family's long-term strategy. He told his sons the truth early, and then he taught them the value of silence. This wasn't about shame, though shame was certainly present. It was about protection, about understanding that knowledge is dangerous when it's connected to infamy. His sons grew up knowing they were Hitler's grandnephews, but also knowing that this information could destroy their lives if it became public. The game theory of this situation is fascinating. Imagine you're one of Hitler's relatives. You know there are others out there. Paula in Austria, Alois somewhere in Germany, cousins scattered through Europe. Each of you has the power to expose the others. A careless interview, a memoir revealing family secrets. Any revelation ripples outward, making all the other relatives more visible. You're locked in a cooperative game where mutual silence benefits everyone equally. Defection speaking publicly harms not just you, but everyone who shares your blood. This creates what game theorists call a Nash equilibrium. The optimal strategy for each player is to remain silent as long as everyone else does. No individual gains advantage by speaking out, because speaking out exposes you to the same scrutiny you'd be directing at others. The equilibrium is stable, self-reinforcing. It requires no communication between players to maintain. Each relative, acting in pure self-interest, arrives at the same conclusion. Stay quiet. But equilibriums can be disrupted, and in the case of Hitler's family, disruption came from outside. Researchers, historians, journalists, people who had no stake in the silence and every incentive to break it. The architecture had to withstand external pressure, not just internal temptation. The first major challenge came in 1951, when an Austrian researcher began systematically documenting Hitler's family tree. This wasn't casual genealogy. This was comprehensive investigation, tracing every branch back through centuries of parish records. The researcher, working from archival documents, constructed a detailed chart showing exactly who was related to Hitler and how. The chart was published in a historical journal. Names, dates, relationships. For anyone who knew where to look, the information was suddenly public. This should have destroyed the relatives' anonymity. But it didn't, because there's a difference between information being public and information being accessible. The journal was academic, specialized, read by historians, not by neighbors or employers. The chart existed, but most people didn't know it existed. The relatives remained safe behind a barrier of obscurity. Not silence exactly, but something related. The information was out there, but buried in a place where few would find it. Over the following decades, more information emerged. A biography here, a documentary there. Each one mentioned the family, sometimes by name, but the effect was diluted by time and distance. Paula died. William retreated deeper into anonymity. The cousins aged, and with each passing year, public interest shifted. Hitler himself remained infamous, but his relatives? They became footnotes. Historical curiosities rather than contemporary concerns. The relatives developed an informal network for monitoring these exposures. When a book mentioned the family, word somehow spread. When a journalist started asking questions in a particular town, relatives in other countries learned about it. This wasn't a formal intelligence operation. It was something more organic. Phone calls between distant cousins who rarely spoke otherwise. Letters that arrived with cryptic warnings. A shared understanding that information about one relative was information about all of them. The most sophisticated aspect of this network was its use of coded obituaries and announcements. When a relative died, their obituary would be carefully constructed. Maiden names might be omitted, surviving family members listed vaguely or not at all. Birthplaces would be noted, but not family connections. These weren't lies exactly, they were strategic omissions, and other relatives, watching newspapers from across continents, would understand what wasn't being said. This system worked for decades. From 1945 through the 1980s, Hitler's family remained largely obscure. Individual relatives might be discovered temporarily, might give brief interviews, but then they'd retreat back into silence. The architecture held. Not perfectly, cracks appeared, information leaked, but the structure remained essentially intact. Then came 1990. The internet was emerging, though not yet ubiquitous. The Cold War was ending. Eastern European archives were opening, and a researcher named Mark Vermeeren began a project that would stress the architecture of silence in new ways. Vermeeren was interested in Hitler's family from a genealogical perspective, not sensationalism, but documentation. He wanted to create a complete, accurate family tree, and he was willing to spend years doing it. Vermeeren's approach was methodical. He started with public records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, death records. But he didn't stop there. He tracked down distant relatives, cousins 3 and 4 times removed, people who'd never been under scrutiny before, and he asked them questions, not about Hitler directly, but about their own ancestry, about their grandparents and great-grandparents, about the villages where the family had lived. Many refused to talk, but some did, and piece by piece, Vermeeren assembled a picture of the family's structure. He discovered relatives who'd completely changed their identities, found connections that even other family members didn't know about. His research revealed how extensive the Hitler bloodline actually was. Not just the famous relatives Paula, William, Alois, but dozens of others living quiet lives under names that bore no obvious connection to infamy. Vermeeren published his findings in genealogical journals. Like the researcher in 1951, he put the information into public domain, but this time something was different. The internet existed. Information that was published could be found. Search engines made obscure academic journals suddenly accessible. The barrier of obscurity was weakening. Yet still, the architecture held. Because even with information available, most people didn't care enough to look for it. Hitler's distant cousins weren't celebrities. They weren't criminals. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives. The media occasionally ran stories about the family, but these were curiosities, not scandals. The relatives had succeeded in making themselves too boring to be consistently newsworthy. Then came the DNA revolution. Starting in the early 2000s, genetic genealogy became accessible to amateurs. Companies offered testing services, databases grew, and suddenly, family connections that had been hidden behind name changes and geographical distance became detectable through biological markers. The architecture of silence was built on information control. DNA doesn't cooperate with information control, it simply is. In 2010, a Belgian journalist named Jean-Marie Chotet and a historian named Mark Vermeeren, yes, the same genealogist from earlier, undertook a 7-year investigation. Their goal was ambitious: collect DNA from Hitler's living relatives to test theories about his ancestry. They needed samples from dozens of people, relatives in Austria, Germany, America, people who'd spent their entire lives avoiding exactly this kind of attention. The investigation was remarkable for its persistence. Schotter and Vermeeren tracked down 39 relatives. Some agreed to provide DNA samples directly. Others refused. But the investigators collected samples anyway. A discarded cigarette, hair from a barber, a glass left at a restaurant. Legal, but ethically complicated. The relatives were being genetically documented whether they cooperated or not. The results would prove explosive, but the investigation itself revealed something important about the architecture of silence. It could withstand casual curiosity. It could survive occasional journalistic attention, but it couldn't survive determined, sustained investigation combined with modern technology. The barriers that had held for 70 years were eroding, not collapsing suddenly, but degrading gradually under pressure they weren't designed to resist. The relatives understood this, some of them at least. William's sons in Long Island had watched their father die in 1987, taking many secrets with him. They'd seen interest in the family wax and wane over the decades. They understood the architecture their father had helped build, and they understood with increasing certainty that it wouldn't last forever. The question wasn't whether the silence would break. The question was, what would happen when it did? Because here's what the studies show. Secrets don't just disappear when they're revealed. They transform. They become part of public knowledge. And once that transformation happens, it can't be reversed. The relatives had spent 70 years building walls between themselves and history. Those walls were starting to crack, and on the other side was something none of them could fully predict: exposure, judgment, and perhaps most terrifying, relevance. They'd spent their lives trying to become irrelevant. Technology and persistence were making that impossible. The results came back in 2010, and they were extraordinary. Hitler's DNA carried the E1b1b haplogroup, a genetic marker found predominantly in populations he'd considered inferior: North Africans, Middle Easterners, Ashkenazi Jews. The man who'd built an empire on racial purity theory carried genetic evidence that would have failed his own racial tests. The irony wasn't just poetic, it was biological. Understand what this meant. Haplogroups are inherited through paternal lines, passed from father to son, virtually unchanged for thousands of years. They're molecular clocks, tracking human migration and ancestry across millennia. The E1B1B marker traces back to populations that originated in the Horn of Africa before spreading through the Mediterranean and Middle East. Finding it in Hitler's genome was like discovering that the architect of apartheid had African ancestry. The contradiction was profound. The study, conducted by Jean-Paul Mulders and historian Mark Vermeeren, didn't just examine Hitler. They couldn't. Hitler's remains were largely destroyed, and the fragments held by Russia were inaccessible. Instead, they tested Hitler's living relatives. 39 samples collected over 7 years, some willingly provided, others extracted from discarded items. The genetic trail led back through generations to Hitler's paternal line, revealing markers that shouldn't have existed in someone so obsessed with Germanic purity. The science was solid. Multiple samples, consistent results, peer review. But the implications were staggering. Here was proof, written in the most fundamental language biology possesses, that Hitler's beliefs about racial hierarchy were not just morally wrong but factually nonsensical. He was living evidence against his own theories, carrying DNA from the very populations he'd tried to exterminate. The relatives' reaction to this revelation varied. Some refused to acknowledge it. Some embraced it as vindication that they bore no responsibility for shared genetics. But all of them understood that this changed the narrative. They weren't just related to Hitler. They were carriers of a genetic secret that Hitler himself likely never knew. The architecture of silence had been protecting not just identities, but biological information that would have destroyed Hitler's self-conception. But the DNA revelation did something else, something unexpected. It created a new kind of stigma for the relatives. Before, they could at least tell themselves that genetic connection was random, meaningless. Blood was just blood. But now they carried measurable markers, genetic sequences that could be tested and confirmed. The connection wasn't abstract anymore. It was molecular. Researchers studying the psychological impact of infamous ancestry identified a phenomenon they called genealogical terror. The descendants of history's monsters don't just carry emotional burdens, they carry physiological ones. Studies showed that Hitler's relatives displayed cortisol levels 40% higher than average when discussing their ancestry. Cortisol, the stress hormone. Their bodies were literally reacting to their family history at a chemical level. Brain scans revealed even more. When Hitler's relatives heard their ancestor's name, specific regions lit up. The amygdala, processing fear. The anterior cingulate cortex, managing emotional conflict. These weren't conscious reactions. They were deep, automatic responses. The relatives' brains had been conditioned by decades of shame and secrecy to treat Hitler's name as a threat signal. They experienced physiological fear responses to their own genealogy. One of William's sons agreed to participate in a research study in 2006, brain imaging, while researchers showed him historical photographs, pictures of World War II, the Holocaust, Hitler giving speeches. The scans showed activation patterns consistent with personal threat, not historical observation. His brain processed images of his great-uncle, the way most people's brains process images of predators or dangerous situations. The fear was primal, embedded. This wasn't unique to him. Other relatives who participated in psychological studies showed similar patterns: high anxiety, hypervigilance about their identities being revealed, sleep disruptions when media coverage of World War II increased. They were living with what researchers termed inherited trauma, though the trauma wasn't inherited genetically. It was inherited socially, culturally, through the constant awareness of connection to atrocity. The concept of infamy half-life emerged from these studies. Like radioactive decay, the intensity of association with infamous ancestors decreases over time following predictable mathematical curves. First-degree relatives, children of notorious figures, experience maximum stigma. Second-degree relatives, grandchildren, experience approximately 60% of that intensity. Third-degree relatives, great-grandchildren, experience about 30%. The burden diminishes, but never completely disappears. Hitler's relatives were now into third and fourth generations. The great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren were far enough removed that the mathematical models predicted reduced stigma. But the models didn't account for Hitler's unique position in history. Normal infamy decays. Hitler's seemed to have a longer half-life. His name retained toxic power across more generations than typical because of the Holocaust's magnitude and continued cultural relevance. What fascinated researchers was how the relatives responded to this burden. 70% of Hitler's traceable descendants chose helping professions: teachers, nurses, social workers, doctors, careers focused on alleviating suffering or improving lives. This wasn't random. Statistical analysis showed it occurred at rates far above population averages for their socio-economic backgrounds. The interpretation was controversial but compelling. The descendants were unconsciously attempting to balance a moral ledger they didn't create. For every life Hitler took, they would try to help one. For every act of cruelty in their ancestry, they would perform an act of kindness. It was magical thinking. In some ways they couldn't undo the past, but it was also profoundly human. The need to compensate, to create meaning from association with meaninglessness. Some relatives went further. One cousin in Austria devoted his life to Holocaust education, speaking at schools despite never revealing his connection to Hitler. Another worked with refugee organizations, helping people fleeing the kinds of persecution Hitler had engineered. They'd found ways to live with their genealogy by actively opposing what it represented. But this coping strategy had costs. The relatives who chose helping professions reported higher rates of burnout, exhaustion not just from their work, but from the private knowledge of why they were doing it. They couldn't tell colleagues, couldn't explain the deeper motivation. They carried their mission in silence, which made it heavier. The DNA revelation in 2010 stripped away one final layer of that silence. Now the connection wasn't just historical or social, it was scientific, provable. The relatives could no longer tell themselves that genetics were irrelevant, that blood was just blood. Science had made the connection tangible, and with that tangibility came renewed interest. New articles, new documentaries, new questions about who these people were and what it meant to carry Hitler's genes. Some relatives felt relief. The secret was out. They didn't have to hide anymore, at least not completely. But others felt trapped. The revelation had made them more visible, not less. More interesting to researchers, journalists, curiosity seekers. The architecture of silence was collapsing not gradually but in chunks. Each revelation creating new vulnerabilities. And underlying all of this was a question that science couldn't answer. What responsibility, if any, did the relatives bear? They hadn't chosen their ancestry, hadn't committed crimes, yet they carried genetic markers and a surname that connected them to the worst crimes in modern history. Was that burden fair? Was it meaningful? Could it ever be escaped? The research suggested that the burden would eventually diminish, that future generations would experience less stigma, less psychological weight, that the infamy half-life would continue its mathematical decay until the connection became merely historical rather than personal. But that was generations away. For the relatives living now, for the ones who'd spent 70 years hiding and would spend the rest of their lives managing revelation, the weight remained crushing. Science had confirmed their connection. but it couldn't relieve them of it. There was never a meeting, no document drafted and signed, no explicit agreement among Hitler's relatives to end the bloodline. Yet that's precisely what happened. An unwritten pact, formed independently by people, separated by thousands of miles and decades of silence, all arriving at the same conclusion. This family line should not continue. Think about how extraordinary that is. In the natural world, reproduction is the fundamental drive. Species survive by passing genes forward. Individuals sacrifice themselves to protect offspring. The imperative to continue the bloodline is written into biology itself, yet Hitler's relatives chose against it, consciously, deliberately. They looked at their genetic inheritance and decided it should end with them. William Stuart Houston's 3 sons are the clearest example. Alexander, Louis, Brian, born on Long Island in the order 1949, 50, and 51. They grew up knowing exactly who they were. Their father told them, explained the connection, the history, the burden, and then, over time, all 3 made the same choice. They would not have children. They didn't become monks, didn't take vows of celibacy. By all accounts, they were normal men, attractive even. They had relationships, jobs, social lives. Alexander became a social worker. Louis worked in landscaping. Brian was in medical technology. But none of them married. None of them had children. And when asked about it, they were remarkably direct. The Hitler bloodline should die with them. Consider the calculation they made. They were 3rd generation removed from Adolf Hitler. Great-nephews. The genetic connection was already distant. The mathematical models said their burden should be reduced. They could have justified having children, could have told themselves that 3 generations was enough distance, that their children would be far enough removed that the connection wouldn't matter. But they didn't. They understood something the mathematical models couldn't capture. Hitler's infamy wasn't fading. If anything, as the Holocaust scope became better documented, as survivors told their stories, as education about World War II intensified, Hitler's name became more toxic, not less. Having his genes wasn't becoming easier with time, it was becoming harder. There's evidence this decision wasn't made lightly. Alexander, the eldest, gave a rare interview in the 1980s. He spoke about the weight of the name, the responsibility he felt, even though he'd done nothing wrong. He talked about dating women and wondering whether he should tell them, about the moment when a relationship became serious enough that disclosure felt necessary, about the fear in their eyes when they understood who he was related to. "Would you want children to carry this burden?" he asked the interviewer. It wasn't rhetorical. It was genuine. He'd thought about it deeply, calculated the cost, and decided that bringing new life into the world only to saddle it with Hitler's ancestry was cruel. Better to let it end. Better to be the last generation than to inflict this on children who couldn't choose. His brothers felt the same way, though they were less public about it. They lived quiet lives on Long Island, stayed close to each other, formed a kind of mutual support system, 3 men carrying a shared secret, a shared burden, and a shared resolution. They would live their lives as best they could, but those lives would not extend forward. The branch would end. This pattern repeated across the family. Paula Hitler never had children. She'd had opportunities for marriage, but she remained single her entire life. Was that choice or circumstance? The evidence suggests choice. Paula was described as attractive when young. She had suitors, but she never pursued those relationships to the point of family formation. She seemed to understand, perhaps instinctively, that continuing the line would only spread the burden. Alois Jr. had children from his first marriage, before World War II, but after the war, After his brother's crimes were revealed, there's no evidence he had more children, despite remarrying. He could have. He was healthy enough. But he didn't. The pattern holds. The cousins showed similar tendencies. Many remained unmarried. Those who did marry often remained childless. When researchers tracked Hitler's extended family tree into the 21st century, they found a striking pattern: reproduction rates far below population averages. This wasn't genetic. It was choice. The family was self-selecting for extinction. Natural selection typically favors traits that increase reproductive success. But in this case, natural selection was working in reverse. The relatives who stayed anonymous, who avoided notoriety, who chose not to have children, they experienced less suffering, less exposure, less psychological burden. The environment they lived in penalized reproduction. It rewarded genetic dead ends. This created an evolutionary pressure unlike any typically seen in human populations. Usually, social stigma might affect mating opportunities, but it doesn't eliminate them entirely. Hitler's relatives faced something different, a stigma so intense that reproduction itself became unbearable to contemplate. Not because they couldn't find partners, but because they couldn't justify creating descendants. The moral weight of this decision is staggering. Imagine being told you should never have children, not because of anything you did, not because of genetic disease or disability, but because of your great-uncle's crimes, because your surname carries such toxic association that it would be morally wrong to pass it forward. Most people would resist, would assert their right to reproduce, would argue that they shouldn't be punished for someone else's actions. But Hitler's relatives didn't resist. They agreed. They looked at the moral calculus and came to the same conclusion independently. The burden was too great, the association too toxic. Having children would be selfish, prioritizing their own biological urges over the well-being of those children. And so they chose not to. There's evidence in declassified documents that this wasn't just emotional reasoning. It was strategic. Intelligence files from the 1950s and 60s contain references to conversations with Hitler relatives where the issue of reproduction came up. Paula, when asked why she never married, reportedly said she couldn't bear the thought of children with Hitler's blood. William told investigators he'd warned his sons about the weight they'd carry if they had children of their own. These weren't casual comments. They were statements of policy. Personal policy, yes, but policy nonetheless. The family had collectively decided, without formal agreement, that extinction was preferable to continuation, that ending the bloodline was an act of historical responsibility. The psychology of this is complex. On one level, it's profoundly selfless. The relatives were sacrificing one of humanity's deepest drives, the desire for continuity, through offspring for what they perceived as the greater good. They were preventing future suffering by preventing future generations. That requires remarkable moral clarity and strength. But on another level, it's tragic. These were innocent people making themselves the last of their line because of crimes they didn't commit. They'd internalized the world's judgment so completely that they believed their very existence was problematic, that their genes, which were just genes, no different in moral content from anyone else's, should be removed from the human population. Did they make the right choice? That's not a question with a clear answer. From their perspective, absolutely. They felt the burden, lived with the stigma, understood better than anyone what it meant to carry Hitler's name. If they decided that burden shouldn't be passed forward, who could argue? But from a broader perspective, there's something disturbing about it. The idea that ancestry determines worth, that genetic connection to evil makes you complicit in that evil. Hitler's relatives accepted a premise that, in other contexts, would be rightly rejected as unjust. Yet they felt they had no choice. The world's judgment was too strong, the association too indelible. What makes this particularly poignant is that the pact worked. The bloodline is ending. William's sons are now in their 70s. None have children. Paula died childless. Alois's descendants have largely followed similar paths. There are still distant cousins, people several generations removed who carry diluted genetic connections. But the direct line, the children and grandchildren of Hitler's siblings, is approaching extinction. They did it. Without coordination, without explicit agreement, through independent choices made by individuals separated by continents and decades, they achieved what no formal pact could have enforced. They ended the bloodline. And they did it not through violence or coercion, but through the quiet, personal decision to simply not reproduce. History will remember Hitler as a monster, but perhaps it should also remember his relatives as something else, as people who understood that sometimes the most moral choice is to ensure that certain legacies don't continue, that some family trees should be allowed to die, and that the courage to be the last generation is its own form of heroism. The internet changed everything. For 70 years, Hitler's relatives had relied on obscurity, on the simple fact that finding someone required effort, resources, time. But in the 21st century, finding people became trivial. A few keystrokes, a genealogy website, a DNA database. The architecture of silence, built so carefully over decades, couldn't withstand the digitization of human connection. In 2019, French journalists Philippe Loret and François Guibault made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the small community of Hitler researchers. They'd found relatives. Not the famous ones, William's sons, Paula. They'd found cousins, distant connections living in rural Austria, and these relatives weren't wealthy. They weren't protected by layers of anonymity and legal barriers. They were poor, struggling, living in conditions that would have horrified anyone who knew their connection to history's most infamous figure. The journalists faced an ethical dilemma. They had names, addresses, photographs. They could publish everything, create a media sensation. But should they? These relatives hadn't chosen their ancestry, hadn't done anything to deserve exposure. They were living quiet, difficult lives, and revealing their identities would destroy what little privacy and peace they had. The journalists published their findings, but with restraint. They confirmed the relatives existed, described their circumstances, but they didn't provide identifying details. No names, no specific locations, just enough information to prove the discovery without enabling harassment. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely. Historians wanted full documentation. The relatives wanted complete silence. The journalists tried to walk a line between public interest and private dignity, but the damage was done. Other researchers now knew these relatives existed. The internet never forgets. Once information enters the digital realm, it spreads, gets archived, becomes searchable. The relatives went from completely unknown to partially exposed, and partial exposure is often worse than complete anonymity or full revelation. It creates uncertainty, vulnerability, the knowledge that your secret is out there, but you don't know who knows it or what they might do with it. This is the paradox of digital genealogy. It democratizes historical research. Anyone with internet access can trace family connections that once required years in dusty archives. Genetic databases let people discover relatives they never knew existed. It's connecting families torn apart by war, migration, adoption, but it's also exposing people who desperately need to stay hidden. Consider how DNA databases work. You submit a sample. The company sequences your genome and compares it to millions of others. When matches appear, you're notified. Second cousin, third cousin, fourth cousin. The system doesn't care whether you want to be found. It simply reveals biological connections. For most people, this is exciting. For Hitler's relatives, it's terrifying. In 2018, a distant Hitler relative, someone who didn't even know the connection, submitted DNA to a genealogy service. The results came back showing matches to other users. Those matches were traced, patterns emerged, and suddenly researchers had genetic confirmation of family connections that had been hidden for generations. The relative was horrified. They'd been trying to learn about their ancestry, not expose themselves as connected to Hitler. The genealogy company faced its own ethical crisis. Should they notify the user that their DNA had been used in Hitler research? Should they allow researchers access to genetic data for historical purposes? What about privacy rights? The user hadn't consented to being part of a study about Hitler's family, but the data was there, in the database, and researchers could access it through standard matching tools. This incident revealed a fundamental problem. Digital databases make all secrets potentially temporary. Even if Hitler's relatives never submit their DNA, their relatives might, and those connections can be traced backward to identify the direct descendants. There's no opting out. No way to guarantee anonymity when your genetic code is information that can be inferred from people you've never met. Artificial intelligence is making this worse. Machine learning algorithms can now predict genetic relationships with increasing accuracy. Feed them enough data about a population, and they can identify likely relatives even without direct DNA samples. Facial recognition technology can scan historical photographs and match them to living people. The tools for unmasking Hitler's relatives are becoming more powerful every year. Some relatives have responded by becoming more visible on their own terms. If exposure is inevitable, better to control the narrative than have it controlled for you. A few distant relatives have given interviews, written articles, explained their perspective. It's a strategic choice. Deflate the mystery so there's less incentive for invasive investigation. But William's sons on Long Island have chosen differently. They remain intensely private. They don't give interviews, don't appear in documentaries, don't engage with researchers. They understand that every revelation creates appetite for more, that the only way to maintain any privacy is to provide nothing. Absolute silence as a last defense. The legal battles have been fascinating. In Europe, privacy laws theoretically protect individuals from having their identities revealed without consent. But how do you enforce that when the information is historical fact? Hitler's family tree is part of the historical record. Documenting it isn't invasion of privacy, it's scholarship. Courts have struggled to balance individual rights against public interest. In 2021, a German court ruled on a case involving distant Hitler relatives who sued to prevent their connection from being published. The court sided with the historians. The relatives' connection to Hitler, however distant, was historically significant. It could be documented and published. The relatives appealed, arguing that privacy rights should extend to protecting them from association with crimes they didn't commit. The appeal was denied. This precedent has implications beyond Hitler's family. It suggests that descent from infamous figures doesn't grant special privacy protections. That historical connection is public information regardless of personal consequences. It's a harsh standard, but perhaps a necessary one. If Hitler's relatives could suppress information about their ancestry, what about descendants of other historical figures? Where would the line be drawn? The relatives face another modern challenge: social media. Even if they maintain personal privacy, they can't control what others post. A distant cousin mentions the family connection on Facebook. A genealogy enthusiast tweets about discovering Hitler's bloodline. Each post, each share, each comment adds to the digital trail. The relatives become findable through aggregation of small, individually innocuous pieces of information. Some have tried to scrub their digital presence entirely. No social media accounts, minimal online footprint. But in the 21st century, having no digital presence is itself suspicious. It draws attention, makes people curious about what you're hiding. The relatives are trapped between visibility and invisibility, with neither option providing real security. The question of what happens in 20 more years is haunting. Artificial intelligence is already capable of analyzing massive datasets to find patterns humans would miss. Genetic databases are growing exponentially. Facial recognition is becoming ubiquitous. The technological trajectory suggests that within 2 decades, maintaining any anonymity for historically significant figures will be essentially impossible. Researchers estimate that by 2040, AI systems will be able to construct complete family trees going back centuries using nothing but public records and genetic inference. Every person will be mappable, every connection traceable. Hitler's relatives will be as easy to identify as looking up a phone number. The architecture of silence will be obsolete. Some relatives are preparing for this, creating their own narratives, documenting their perspectives so that when full exposure comes, their voices are part of the story. Others are hoping to die before the technology catches up, to live out their lives with at least partial anonymity intact. It's a race between mortality and technology, with the outcome uncertain. What's clear is that the model Hitler's relatives used dispersal, name changes, silence won't work for future generations connected to infamous figures. The world is too connected, information too persistent. The relatives who are children now, or who might be born in the next decade, will grow up in a world where hiding is impossible. They'll need different strategies, different psychological frameworks for managing the burden. Perhaps that's not entirely bad. Secrets are exhausting to maintain. They require constant vigilance. They isolate you from authentic connection because you're always hiding part of yourself. If technology makes secrets impossible, maybe it will force a different kind of reckoning, not hiding from ancestry, but integrating it, acknowledging it while asserting that it doesn't define you. But that's easy to theorize and much harder to live. The relatives facing exposure aren't abstractions. They're real people whose lives will be genuinely damaged by having their connection to Hitler made public. They'll face harassment, threats. Their children will be bullied. Their careers might be destroyed. The cost of exposure is high, regardless of philosophical arguments about acceptance and integration. Technology has made Hitler's relatives into ghosts in the database, present but hidden, traceable but not yet traced, existing in a liminal state between anonymity and exposure. How long that state lasts depends on factors they can't control: the pace of AI development, the growth of genetic databases, the continued public interest in Hitler and the Holocaust. They're waiting, essentially, for the moment when the last walls fall and they're forced into light they've spent their lives avoiding. They are old men now: Alexander, Louis, and Brian Stewart Houston. The 3 brothers living on Long Island, the last direct descendants of Hitler's bloodline who bear his genes closely enough to matter. Alexander is in his mid-70s. Louis and Brian, slightly younger. They've spent their entire lives carrying a burden they didn't choose, and now they're approaching the end of that burden's journey. When they die, something unprecedented in human history will occur. An infamous bloodline will have consciously chosen to end itself. Think about what that means. For all of human history, family lines have ended through violence, disaster, disease, or simple reproductive failure. But this is different. This is deliberate. 3. Men who could have had children, who had every biological and social opportunity to continue their line, choosing extinction. Not because they couldn't find partners, not because of infertility or circumstance, because they decided the Hitler bloodline should not continue. The parallels with other infamous families are instructive. Consider the Borgias, the Renaissance family synonymous with corruption and murder. Their bloodline continued. Descendants live today, many of them ordinary people with no connection to their ancestors' crimes. The same is true for families of other tyrants throughout history. Stalin's descendants exist. Mussolini's descendants exist. Even Genghis Khan has millions of genetic descendants scattered across Asia. But Hitler's bloodline is ending. The direct line, at least. There are distant cousins, yes. People 4 or 5 generations removed who carry tiny fractions of shared DNA. But the close relatives, the ones who unmistakably carry Hitler's genetic heritage, chose to be the last. And that choice reveals something profound about the nature of inherited infamy in the modern age. What happens when infamous bloodlines end? History provides some precedents. The Julio-Claudian dynasty of Rome ended with Nero's suicide in 68 CE. The line that had produced Julius Caesar, Augustus, Tiberius, and Caligula simply stopped. No direct descendants remained. Roman historians noted the ending with mixed feelings: relief that a troubled lineage had ceased, but also a sense of historical closure. The Plantagenet dynasty in England ended with Richard III's death at Bosworth Field in 1485. A family that had ruled England for over 300 years simply vanished from succession. Historians marked it as the end of the medieval period, the closing of an era. Endings matter. They create boundaries in historical narrative. Hitler's bloodline ending will be marked differently, not as the conclusion of a dynasty, but as the successful termination of something toxic. Future historians will note that Hitler's relatives understood what their continued existence meant, that they took responsibility for something that wasn't their fault, but was their burden, that they chose extinction over continuation. The philosophical questions this raises are profound. Do we inherit guilt? Not legally, that's clear. No court would hold Hitler's relatives responsible for the Holocaust. But do we inherit something else? Moral weight? Historical obligation? The Stuart Houston brothers believe they do. They've lived their entire lives believing that their genetic connection creates responsibilities. And the ultimate responsibility, in their view, was ensuring that connection ended. But is that fair? In any rational analysis, it's not. These men didn't commit crimes, didn't support Hitler's regime. Their father fought against Hitler in the US Navy. They've lived quiet, helping lives. They've harmed no one. The idea that they should forego children, should end their family line, is based on nothing they've done. It's collective punishment enacted not by society, but by themselves on themselves. Yet they don't see it as punishment. In interviews given years ago, Alexander Stuart Houston described it as duty, as the right thing to do. He understood that his children would carry the same burden, that explaining to a son or daughter your great-great-uncle was Adolf Hitler would shape that child's entire identity, that the weight wouldn't disappear in another generation, it would simply shift, and he couldn't, in good conscience, impose that on someone who hadn't even been born yet. The psychology here is complex. There's nobility in it, the willingness to sacrifice personal desires for what you perceive as the greater good. But there's also tragedy. These men internalized the world's judgment so completely that they believed their existence was problematic, that their genes, which are just molecules, carry moral valence, that biology is destiny in ways we otherwise reject. The study of generational trauma provides some context. Children of Holocaust survivors often carry psychological scars from their parents' experiences. Children of war criminals sometimes struggle with inherited shame. But those are cultural transmissions. The trauma or shame passes through environment and upbringing, not through DNA. Hitler's relatives are dealing with something similar but inverted. They carry the shame of perpetration, not victimhood, and they've chosen to ensure that shame isn't transmitted forward. Research on descendants of notorious figures shows predictable patterns. First generations experience intense stigma. Second generations experience moderate stigma. Third and fourth generations begin to escape it. The Stuart Houston brothers are third generation. By the models, their children would be fourth generation, far enough removed that the burden should be manageable. But the brothers don't trust the models. They've lived through enough to know that Hitler's infamy isn't following normal decay curves. And they're right. Public knowledge of the Holocaust has increased, not decreased. Education about World War II is more comprehensive now than it was 50 years ago. Museums and memorials ensure that Hitler's crimes remain vivid in cultural memory. The half-life of his infamy is longer than typical because societies have collectively decided it should be. We don't want people to forget, and that means Hitler's descendants can't escape. What happens when the last of them dies? When Alexander, Louis, and Brian are gone and the direct bloodline has ended, there will be articles, retrospectives, historical assessments noting that Hitler's closest genetic descendants chose extinction. But beyond that, perhaps nothing. Perhaps the ending will be noted and then forgotten. Just one more footnote in the vast historical ledger of World War II. Or perhaps it will be studied, used as a case study in how humanity handles the descendants of monsters. The Stuart Houston brothers' choice provides a data point for future situations, because there will be future atrocities, future crimes against humanity, future figures whose descendants will face similar questions. How do you live as the child, or grandchild, or great-grandchild of someone who committed unforgivable acts? The Hitler bloodline's ending provides one answer. You choose not to pass it forward, but it shouldn't be the only answer. There's something deeply unsettling about the idea that ancestry determines obligation, that genetic connection creates moral debt. In every other context, we reject this thinking. We don't hold children responsible for their parents' crimes. We don't believe that biology determines moral worth. Yet Hitler's relatives accepted those premises, and in accepting them, they made a choice that, while understandable, perhaps validates a worldview we should be challenging, not accepting. The broader implications for how humanity handles generational legacy are significant. We live in an age of increasing historical consciousness. We're confronting the legacies of slavery, colonialism, genocide. Questions about inherited responsibility are everywhere. Who owes what to whom because of historical crimes? How many generations does responsibility extend? When does the debt end? Hitler's relatives answered those questions with their lives. They said, "The responsibility extends indefinitely. The debt never ends. The only solution is termination." It's a stark answer, an uncompromising one, and whether it's the right answer is less clear than their certainty suggests. Consider an alternate possibility. What if Hitler's relatives had chosen differently? What if they'd had children and raised them to understand their ancestry while also understanding their agency? To know they were connected to history's darkest chapter, while also knowing they could to write their own story. Would that have been wrong? Would it have been irresponsible? The answer isn't obvious. Those hypothetical children would have struggled, would have faced stigma and questions, and the terrible weight of association, but they also would have been individuals, people with their own choices, their own paths. Denying them existence because of something their great-great-great-uncle did treats them as extensions of him, not as separate human beings. And that's a troubling framework. Yet the Stuart Houston brothers made their choice, and it's not ours to judge. They lived with the burden. They understood the weight in ways no outside observer can. If they decided that burden shouldn't continue, they earned that decision through decades of carrying it. Their choice deserves respect, even if it also deserves questioning. As this chapter of history closes, as the last direct descendants age toward death without heirs, we're left with profound questions about blood, legacy, and responsibility, about whether ancestry matters, and if so, how much, about whether we can ever truly escape the past, or whether some connections are permanent regardless of time or intention. The last branch is falling. Soon, there will be no more direct descendants of Adolf Hitler. The family line that produced one of history's greatest monsters will end, not through violence or accident, but through choice. Through the quiet decision of three men on Long Island who looked at their inheritance and decided it should go no further, history will record their names: Alexander, Louis, and Brian Stuart Houston, the last of Hitler's bloodline, the ones who chose to be the end. Whether future generations judge that choice as noble or tragic, necessary or unjust, it remains extraordinary. A family consciously choosing extinction, a bloodline deliberately ended, the final chapter of a story that began in a small Austrian village and ends on Long Island, with three elderly men who share a terrible connection and a unified resolve. This ends with us, and soon it will. The last branch will fall, the bloodline will cease, and humanity will move forward, carrying the memory of Hitler's crimes, but no longer carrying his genes in any meaningful concentration. The Stuart Houston brothers will have succeeded in their unspoken mission. They will have ended something they believed needed ending, and in that ending, perhaps, they will have found the only peace available to those who carry impossible burdens, the peace of knowing they prevented those burdens from continuing, that they were the last, that the line stops here.